Brandon Whitfield leaned back in his leather chair at the plaintiff's table, adjusting the cuffs of his $4,000 canali suit, and smirked when Judge Henderson asked where Laura's lawyer was. His mother Diane laughed softly behind her hand from the gallery. His sister Nicole rolled her eyes and practiced pity. "No attorney, Your Honor," Brandon said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "She couldn't afford one. I made sure of that," the gallery murmured. Judge Henderson's face tightened with concern. "Mrs. Whitfield," the judge said carefully, "we cannot delay these proceedings indefinitely." Brandon's lawyer, Richard Thornhill, adjusted his cufflinks and stood. "If I may, Your Honor, my client has been more than generous. Mrs. Whitfield had months to secure representation. This is clearly a delaying tactic." But Brandon forgot something crucial about Laura's silence. He forgot that quiet women often have the loudest mothers. Then the courtroom doors opened. A woman in a tailored navy suit walked in, her heels striking the marble floor like a judge's gavel. Brandon's lawyer went rigid. Brandon's smirk died. The woman spoke calmly, her voice carrying authority that filled every corner of the room. "My apologies for the delay. Traffic from Washington, D.C. is always unpredictable." She looked directly at Laura, and for the first time in months, Laura's shoulders straightened. "Elizabeth Harper. I represent the respondent." Then she turned to face Brandon, and her next words fell like a sentence. "I am also her mother." The air inside Courtroom 4B of the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, smelled like industrial cleaner and old wood polish, the scent of institutions that had witnessed thousands of endings. For Brandon Whitfield, however, the atmosphere smelled like inevitability, like a victory he'd already secured 3 months ago when he froze Laura's access to their joint accounts. Brandon sat beside Richard Thornhill, senior partner at Thornhill and Associates, a boutique firm specializing in asset protection for wealthy men going through difficult separations. Richard didn't just win divorce cases, he engineered financial massacres. His reputation in Columbus legal circles was simple. Hire Richard Thornhill, and your ex-wife ends up in a studio apartment. Richard smoothed his burgundy tie, his eyes scanning the defense table with clinical detachment. "It doesn't matter if she shows up, Brandon," Richard murmured, his voice like gravel scraping concrete. "We filed the emergency asset freeze on Tuesday. She has no liquidity. No retainer means no attorney. No attorney means she'll take whatever we offer or leave with nothing." Brandon looked across the aisle at Laura. She looked smaller than he remembered. She wore a simple gray dress, one she'd bought years ago from a discount outlet, and her hands were folded so tightly on the scratched oak table that her knuckles had gone white. There were no stacks of legal documents in front of her, no water pitcher, no paralegal whispering strategy. Just Laura, sitting alone, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. "Look at her," Brandon said, loud enough for the spectators in the back rows to hear. "This is pathetic. I actually feel sorry for her. It's like watching someone walk into traffic." From the gallery behind Brandon, his mother Diane Whitfield leaned forward, whispering to his sister Nicole. Both women wore expensive wool coats and tasteful jewelry, the uniform of old Columbus money. Diane's voice carried just enough to be heard. "I told Brandon years ago she wasn't his equal. She never understood how to navigate our world." Nicole nodded. She thought love was enough. How naive. The bailiff, Officer Ken Walters, stepped forward and called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Lawrence P. Henderson presiding. Judge Lawrence Henderson swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing. He was a man in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair, wire-frame glasses, and a reputation for efficiency bordering on impatience. He'd been a family court judge for 12 years and had seen enough divorces to lose faith in the institution of marriage entirely. He took his seat and opened the file in front of him without ceremony. "Be seated." The courtroom sat. Judge Henderson scanned the first page. Case number 2025-DR03347, Whitfield versus Whitfield. Preliminary hearing regarding division of assets, spousal support, and custody arrangements. He looked up at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Thornhill, good to see you again." "Your Honor," Richard said smoothly, rising halfway before sitting back down. The judge's eyes moved to the defense table, his brow furrowed. "Mrs. Whitfield," Judge Henderson said, "I see you're alone. Are you expecting legal representation?" Laura cleared her throat. Her voice came out soft, trembling. "Yes, Your Honor. She should be here any minute." Brandon let out a loud, theatrical laugh. Several people in the gallery turned to look. Judge Henderson's gaze snapped to Brandon like a whip. Is something amusing, Mr. Whitfield? Richard Thornhill stood immediately, placing a restraining hand on Brandon's shoulder. Apologies, Your Honor. My client is simply frustrated by the delays. Control your client's emotions, Mr. Thornhill, the judge warned sharply. He turned back to Laura. Mrs. Whitfield, this hearing was scheduled 6 weeks ago. The court's time is valuable. I know, Your Honor, Laura said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. She's coming. There was traffic from... Traffic? Brandon interrupted, leaning forward. Or maybe the attorney realized you can't pay, Laura. Oh, wait, you can't pay because I canceled your cards this morning. Mr. Whitfield, Judge Henderson slammed his gavel once. The crack echoed like a gunshot. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. Brandon stood, buttoning his suit jacket with exaggerated humility. My sincerest apologies, Your Honor. He turned to look at Laura, his eyes cold. I'm just trying to be fair. My wife is clearly confused. She doesn't understand the complexity of asset law. She has no income, no resources, no professional experience. I offered her a generous settlement last week, $80,000, and the 2019 Toyota Camry. She refused. He paused for effect. I tried to help you, Laura, but you insisted on playing games. Now look where you are, sitting there with nothing. No lawyer because no one wants a charity case. Mr. Thornhill, muzzle your client, Judge Henderson snapped. Richard stood quickly. Your Honor, while my client's passion is regrettable, his point stands. We are wasting the court's valuable time. Mrs. Whitfield has clearly failed to secure representation. Under Ohio Rule of Civil Procedure 41B1, we move to proceed immediately with a default judgment on asset division. Judge Henderson looked at Laura. He looked tired, resigned. Mrs. Whitfield, the judge said slowly, Mr. Thornhill is technically correct. If you cannot produce an attorney right now, I'll have to assume you're representing yourself pro se. And given the forensic complexity of your husband's real estate holdings, that would be inadvisable. I'm not representing myself, Laura said, her eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom. Please, just 2 more minutes. Brandon laughed again, a cruel barking sound. She's stalling, Brandon hissed to Richard. She's got nobody. Her parents are dead. Her friends are all book club moms. Who's she going to call? From the gallery, Diane leaned over to Nicole. This is embarrassing. I almost feel bad for her. Nicole whispered back, almost. Richard Thornhill sensed the moment. He stood, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Your Honor, I move to strike the respondent's request for continuance. Let's end this charade with dignity. Judge Henderson sighed. He picked up his gavel. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry. We cannot wait any longer. I'm going to proceed with... Bam. The double doors at the back of Courtroom 4B didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the brass hinges and sent a gust of hallway air rushing into the stale room. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. Everyone turned. Brandon spun around in his chair, annoyed at the interruption. Richard Thornhill frowned, his pen hovering over his legal pad. The courtroom fell into stunned, breathless silence. Standing in the doorway was a woman in her mid-60s. Though her posture was as rigid and commanding as a military officer's, she wore a tailored navy suit that looked like it cost more than Brandon's car payment. Her silver hair was cut into a sharp, precise bob. She wore thin-framed glasses that caught the overhead lights. Her expression was calm, controlled, and utterly terrifying. Behind her stood 2 younger associates, a man and a woman, both carrying leather briefcases and moving in perfect sync like an honor guard. The woman didn't rush. She walked down the center aisle with measured, deliberate steps. Each click of her heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. Richard Thornhill's face went pale. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. No, Richard whispered, genuine fear creeping into his voice. That's not possible. Who is that? Brandon asked, confused by his lawyer's reaction. The woman reached the defense table. She didn't look at Laura. She didn't look at the judge. She turned slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at Brandon Whitfield. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. My apologies for the delay, she said, her voice smooth, cultured, and projecting to every corner of the room. I had to file several motions with the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals this morning regarding the forensic review of your financial disclosures, Mr. Whitfield. The offshore transfers took longer to catalog than expected. Brandon froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Counselor, please state your name for the record." The woman placed a cream-colored business card on the court reporter's desk. She turned to face the judge. "Elizabeth Harper," she said clearly. "Senior partner at Harper, Caldwell, and Sterling of Washington, D.C. I'm entering my appearance as counsel for the respondent, Laura Whitfield." She paused. The silence in the room was absolute. Then she looked back at Brandon, her expression unchanging. "I am also her mother." The laughter stopped when the doors opened. And the world Brandon Whitfield had built on mockery and cruelty began to crumble. 7 years earlier, Laura hadn't been the silent woman sitting in a courtroom with white knuckles and a borrowed dress. She'd been the woman across the Charity Gala ballroom in Cleveland, Ohio, that Brandon Whitfield couldn't look away from. It was a warm June evening at the Ritz-Carlton, and the room glittered with old money and new ambition. Laura was there as a volunteer coordinator for the Children's Literacy Foundation, setting up auction displays and making sure donors had champagne refills. She wore a simple black dress she'd bought on clearance and pearl earrings her grandmother had given her. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. But Brandon noticed. He was 32 then, newly successful, riding the wave of his first major real estate development, a mixed-use property in downtown Columbus that had been featured in Ohio Business Magazine. He wore confidence like cologne, and when he approached Laura at the silent auction table, his smile was disarming. "You're working too hard," Brandon said, handing her a glass of champagne. "The auction doesn't start for another hour." Laura looked up, startled. "I thank you, but I'm not really supposed to drink while I'm working." "Then stop working," Brandon said, his eyes crinkling with practiced charm. "I'm Brandon Whitfield. And you are?" "Laura Bennett." She took the glass hesitantly. "I'm just a volunteer. I don't usually attend these things as a guest." "Well, tonight you do." Brandon raised his glass. "2 accidental meetings." Laura smiled. It was genuine, unguarded. She had no idea she was being hunted. Over the next 3 months, Brandon pursued Laura with the same focus he applied to closing real estate deals. Flowers arrived at her small apartment in Lakewood. He took her to dinners at restaurants she'd only read about in magazines. He introduced her to his mother Diane, who smiled politely while mentally cataloging everything Laura lacked: pedigree, polish, connections. But Brandon was careful. He never let Laura see the calculation. He made her feel like she was the center of his world. "You're different," Brandon told her one evening as they sat on the pier at Edgewater Park, watching the sunset over Lake Erie. "Everyone else in my life wants something from me. You just want me." Laura leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's because I do." She believed him. She believed all of it. When Brandon proposed 6 months later, on bended knee at the top of Terminal Tower, with the Columbus skyline glowing behind them, Laura said yes without hesitation. She didn't see the warning signs. Or maybe she saw them and convinced herself they were just quirks of a man used to being in control. Like the way Brandon helped her choose her wedding dress, steering her away from the style she loved towards something more appropriate for a Whitfield bride. Or the way he insisted they live in Columbus instead of Cleveland, away from Laura's friends and the nonprofit work she loved. Or the way he casually mentioned, 2 weeks before the wedding, that he drafted a prenuptial agreement. "It's just a formality," Brandon said, sliding the document across the table at his attorney's office. "Protects both of us. Standard stuff." Laura looked at the 40-page document. "Brandon, I don't understand half of this. Shouldn't I have my own lawyer look at it?" Brandon's smile tightened. "Laura, the wedding is in 2 weeks. Do you know how long it takes to find an attorney? We'd have to postpone." "Then maybe we should." "You don't trust me?" Brandon's voice went cold. "After everything I've given you? The ring? The wedding? The life you're about to have? You don't trust me?" Laura felt her chest tighten. "Of course I trust you." "Then sign it." She signed it. The wedding was beautiful. Diane Whitfield made sure of that. She controlled every detail: the flowers, the menu, the guest list. Laura's few friends from Cleveland were seated in the back. Her aunt and uncle, who'd raised her after her parents died, were placed at a table near the kitchen. "We have to be strategic about seating," Diane explained when Laura protested. "Brandon's business associates need to be front and center. It's about optics, dear." Laura learned quickly that in the Whitfield family, Optics mattered more than anything else. After the wedding, Brandon's charm began to fade like paint in sunlight. It started small. He suggested Laura quit her job at the nonprofit. "You don't need to work anymore," Brandon said over breakfast one morning. "I make more than enough for both of us. Besides, it doesn't look good my wife working at a charity. People will think I can't provide." "But I love that work," Laura said. "And I love you." Brandon kissed her forehead. "Trust me on this." So Laura quit. Then Brandon started managing all their finances. He opened new bank accounts, joint accounts, technically, but only he had access to the online banking. He gave Laura a credit card with a $500 monthly limit for household expenses. "I'm just trying to keep things organized," Brandon explained when Laura asked why she couldn't see their bank statements. "You don't need to worry about money. That's my job." Laura told herself it was practical, efficient, but slowly, quietly, she was disappearing. Brandon controlled where they went, who they saw, how they spent their time. He made decisions and presented them as joint choices. "I thought we could have dinner with my parents this weekend instead of visiting your aunt," Brandon would say. Not a question, a statement. When Laura tried to reconnect with her old friends from Cleveland, Brandon always had reasons why it wasn't a good time. "That's a 3-hour drive, Laura." "For what? Lunch with people you barely talk to anymore?" And Diane was a master of passive-aggressive cruelty. "That's an interesting choice of outfit," Diane would say at family dinners, her eyes traveling over Laura's dress with surgical precision. "Very casual." Or, "Brandon mentioned you're not working anymore. That must give you so much free time. What do you do all day?" Nicole, Brandon's younger sister, treated Laura like a charity project, someone to be pitied and corrected. "You should really get your hair done professionally," Nicole said once at a family brunch. "I have a wonderful stylist. He's expensive, but worth it." Laura stopped going to family events unless absolutely required. She spent her days alone in their Upper Arlington home, a beautiful prison with crown molding and marble countertops. She read books. She took long walks. She learned to be invisible. Because invisibility was safer than conflict. Whenever Laura tried to assert herself to suggest they needed to talk about their finances, or to ask why Brandon came home late so often, he would shut her down with the efficiency of someone closing a business deal. "Laura, I'm tired. Can we not do this right now?" Or, "You're being emotional. We'll talk when you're calm." And the worst, "I'm doing everything for you, for us. Why can't you just be grateful?" So Laura learned to be grateful, or at least to pretend. She became the wife Brandon wanted, silent, accommodating, small. But silence, Laura discovered, had a strange power. When you're quiet long enough, people forget you're listening. They forget you're watching. They forget you're keeping track. And Laura was keeping track. She noticed when Brandon started coming home later and later, smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. She noticed the sudden increase in business trips to Phoenix and Miami. She noticed the way he'd changed his phone password and started keeping his laptop locked. Laura said nothing. She just watched. And one night, when Brandon was in the shower, she opened his laptop, still logged in from earlier, and started scrolling through his emails. What she found made her stomach drop. Shell companies, hidden accounts, financial transfers she'd never heard about, properties registered in names she didn't recognize. Brandon wasn't just wealthy, he was hiding wealth. And then she found the other emails, the ones from a woman named Cassandra, the ones with subject lines like, "Can't wait to see you in Scottsdale," and "Last night was amazing." Laura closed the laptop carefully. She went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. When Brandon emerged from the shower, she was sitting on the bed, hands folded, expression neutral. "Everything okay?" Brandon asked, toweling off his hair. "Fine," Laura said. "I'm just tired." That was the moment Laura made a decision. She couldn't fight Brandon openly. He controlled the money, the narrative, the family. He had lawyers and power and a lifetime of getting what he wanted. But Laura had something else. Patience. For the next 2 years, Laura played the role of the dutiful, invisible wife. But behind the scenes, she was documenting everything. She created a secret email account. She forwarded incriminating emails to herself. She took photos of bank statements Brandon left on his desk. She kept a journal, dates, times, conversations. She learned the names of Brandon's shell companies. She tracked his business trips. She quietly befriended the cleaning service employee who came twice a week and learned about the second property in Dublin that Brandon claimed was for investment purposes. Laura became a ghost in her own marriage, silent, unseen, and utterly focused. And then, one morning in March, Brandon served her with divorce papers. He did it over breakfast, sliding the manila envelope across the kitchen table like it was a contract negotiation. "I think we both know this isn't working," Brandon said, his tone businesslike. "I've filed for divorce. My attorney says it'll be quick and clean if you don't fight it." Laura stared at the envelope. "Quick and clean. You'll get a fair settlement. The prenup is clear. You'll be fine." "Where will I go?" Brandon shrugged. "That's not really my problem anymore, Laura." That afternoon, Brandon froze their joint accounts. He canceled her credit card. He changed the locks on the house and had her belongings packed into boxes by a moving company. Laura found herself in a budget inn in Worthington, Ohio, with 2 suitcases, $347 in cash, and no way to hire an attorney. She spent 2 days calling legal aid clinics. No one would take the case against Richard Thornhill. On the third night, staring at the water-stained ceiling with $89 left, Laura picked up her phone. She pulled up the contacts she'd saved but never called. Elizabeth Harper, Mom. She stared at the name for a long time. Then she pressed dial. The phone rang 3 times. Then a voice, calm, controlled, familiar in a way that made Laura's chest ache. "Laura?" Laura's voice broke. "Mom, I need help." There was a pause. Then Elizabeth Harper said, in a tone that made Laura feel like she was 8 years old again, "Tell me everything." And Elizabeth Harper answered. Brandon Whitfield stood in his office on the 15th floor of the Huntington Center, looking out over the Columbus skyline with the satisfaction of a man who'd just closed a deal. The divorce papers had been served. Laura was out of the house. The accounts were frozen. It was March 12th, and everything was going according to plan. "She'll fold within a week," Brandon said into his phone, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was talking to Richard Thornhill, his attorney. "She has no options left." "Probably sooner," Richard replied, his voice crackling over the Bluetooth speaker. "She has no access to funds, no employment history, and no legal representation. I'll file for the preliminary hearing on Monday. By the end of the month, this will be over." "Good. I want this done before the Phoenix deal closes. I don't need her digging into my finances." "She won't have time to dig, Brandon. Trust me." Brandon ended the call and smiled at his reflection in the window. He'd been planning this divorce for 6 months, ever since he'd decided that being married to Laura Bennett had stopped being useful and started being inconvenient. She didn't fit his trajectory anymore. She didn't have the social connections he needed. She didn't understand the world he was building. And more importantly, she'd started asking questions about his business. So Brandon had systematically built a legal fortress around his assets. He'd restructured his properties under a Delaware LLC called Whitfield Ventures. He'd moved cash into accounts Laura didn't know existed. He'd backdated documents and created paper trails that made it look like he'd always kept his finances separate. And then he'd served her with divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and had her moved out by noon. It was ruthless, efficient, exactly the way Brandon did business. That evening, Brandon met his mother and sister for dinner at Hyde Park Prime Steakhouse in Upper Arlington. Diane Whitfield sat at the head of the table, a glass of Chardonnay in hand, looking every bit the Columbus matriarch she'd spent 60 years becoming. Nicole sat beside her, scrolling through her phone with manicured nails. "So it's official?" Diane asked as Brandon sat down. "Served her this morning," Brandon said, flagging down the waiter for a scotch. "She's out of the house. Accounts are frozen. She won't be able to afford a lawyer." Diane took a sip of her wine. "I always said she wasn't right for you, Brandon. She didn't have the breeding." "She was nice enough," Nicole said absently. "Just boring. And those outfits." Brandon laughed. "Well, she won't be my problem much longer." "What did she say when you served her?" Diane asked. Brandon shrugged. "Not much. She just stared at the papers. I think she was in shock." "Good," Diane said. "That means she won't fight." "She can't fight," Brandon corrected. "I made sure of it. Richard Thornhill is the best divorce attorney in Ohio. He's going to steamroll this. Laura will be lucky to walk away with $50,000 in her car." Nicole finally looked up from her phone. "Isn't that kind of harsh? I mean, you guys were married for 7 years." Brandon's smile faded. "Nicole, this is business. Laura had a good run. She lived in a beautiful house, wore nice jewelry, attended exclusive events. She got more out of this marriage than she ever could have on her own. Now it's over. Diane nodded approvingly. Exactly. You gave her a lifestyle she never could have achieved herself. She should be grateful. The waiter arrived with Brandon's scotch. He raised his glass. To moving forward. Diane and Nicole raised their glasses. To moving forward. Over the next 3 weeks, Brandon executed his strategy with precision. He hired a private investigator to follow Laura, hoping to document erratic behavior. He had his accountant prepare financial statements that drastically underrepresented his net worth. He worked with Richard Thornhill to draft motions that painted Laura as financially incompetent and emotionally unstable. And most importantly, he made sure Laura couldn't access any resources that might allow her to fight back. On March 25th, Brandon received an email from Richard Thornhill. Subject: Whitfield v. Whitfield. Update. Brandon, Laura has not retained counsel. She called my office twice asking for an extension to secure representation, but I denied both requests. We have a preliminary hearing scheduled for April 10th. If she shows up without an attorney, the judge will likely proceed with a default judgment in your favor. This is going to be easier than I thought. Richard. Brandon forwarded the email to his mother with a single word: victory. Diane responded immediately. I never doubted you, darling. That woman never stood a chance. On April 8th, 2 days before the hearing, Brandon was in his office reviewing Richard Thornhill's proposed settlement. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Diane. Nicole and I will be at the hearing. We want to see Laura's face when she realizes she's lost. Brandon smiled and texted back, front row seats, this'll be good. That same afternoon, Richard Thornhill called Brandon with an update. Still no attorney on record for Laura, Richard said, sounding pleased. I checked the court docket this morning. She's going to have to represent herself. This is basically over, Brandon. You're sure? Brandon asked. Positive. If she'd hired someone, they would have filed an appearance by now. She's showing up alone. Brandon leaned back in his chair, exhaling with satisfaction. Then let's finish this. On April 9th, the day before the hearing, Laura sat in her hotel room and packed the one professional outfit she owned, the gray dress she'd worn to charity events when she was still Mrs. Whitfield. Her phone rang. It was Elizabeth. Are you ready? Elizabeth asked. Laura swallowed hard. I don't know. Brandon thinks I'm coming alone. He thinks I've given up. Good, Elizabeth said. Let him think that. Mom, are you sure about this? If you walk in there tomorrow, he's going to learn a very expensive lesson. Elizabeth interrupted calmly. Laura, I need you to do something for me. What? When you walk into that courtroom tomorrow, I need you to sit at that table and say nothing, no matter what Brandon says, no matter what his lawyer says, no matter how cruel they are. You stay silent. Why? Because I want them confident, Elizabeth said. I want them arrogant. I want them so certain they've won that they stop paying attention to the doors. Laura closed her eyes. Okay, I'll be there, Elizabeth said. I promise. The call ended. Laura sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For 7 years, she'd been invisible. Tomorrow, she'd let Brandon see exactly what he'd underestimated. On the morning of April 10th, Brandon Whitfield walked into the Franklin County Courthouse wearing his $4,000 suit and a smile that said he'd already won. Richard Thornhill met him in the hallway, briefcase in hand. Ready? Richard asked. More than ready, Brandon said. Let's end this. They walked into courtroom 4B. Diane and Nicole were already seated in the gallery, dressed like they were attending a social event. And at the defense table, sitting alone with her hands folded, was Laura. She wore the same gray dress Brandon remembered. She had no files, no attorney, no hope. Brandon leaned over to Richard and whispered, This is almost too easy. Richard smiled. That's because it is. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Henderson entered, and Brandon Whitfield prepared to destroy his wife in open court. What he didn't know was that 150 miles away, Elizabeth Harper was already in her car, driving toward Columbus, with a briefcase full of evidence that would end Brandon's world. The first 30 minutes of the hearing went exactly as Brandon had planned. Judge Henderson called the case, scanned the docket, and frowned at the empty chair beside Laura. Mrs. Whitfield, the judge said, his tone edging toward impatience, I see you're unrepresented. Is that correct? Laura's voice was quiet. My attorney should be here soon, Your Honor. Brandon didn't even try to hide his smirk. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, radiating satisfaction. Richard Thornhill stood smoothly. Your Honor, if I may, we've waited long enough. Mrs. Whitfield has had 6 weeks to secure counsel. This is clearly a stalling tactic. I move that we proceed immediately. Judge Henderson looked at Laura. She said nothing. The judge sighed. Mrs. Whitfield, the court cannot hold these proceedings indefinitely. If your attorney isn't here in the next 5 minutes, I'll have no choice but to assume you're proceeding pro se. She's not coming, Your Honor, Brandon said loudly. Laura doesn't have an attorney because she can't afford one. I made sure of that. The gallery gasped. Even Richard Thornhill shot Brandon a warning look. Judge Henderson's face hardened. Mr. Whitfield, one more outburst and you'll be held in contempt. Do you understand? Brandon stood, smoothing his suit jacket with mock contrition. My apologies, Your Honor. I'm simply being honest. My wife has no resources. She has no career. She spent our entire marriage dependent on me for everything financially, socially, emotionally. I offered her a fair settlement, and she refused. Now she's wasting the court's time. From the gallery, Diane whispered loudly to Nicole. He's absolutely right. She's embarrassing herself. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. Order. He turned back to Laura. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes. If your attorney doesn't arrive, we're moving forward. Laura's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. Please, Your Honor. 2 minutes. Brandon laughed a sharp, mocking sound. 2 minutes for what, Laura? To come up with another excuse? You don't have a lawyer. You don't have money. You don't have anything. He turned to face her fully, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper that still carried across the silent courtroom. You were nothing when I met you, and you're nothing now. This is over. Just accept it. Laura didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, her jaw set. Richard Thornhill stood again. Your Honor, my client has been more than patient, more than generous. Mrs. Whitfield is clearly unprepared to proceed. In the interest of judicial efficiency, I renew my motion for an immediate default judgment. Judge Henderson looked at the clock on the wall. He looked at Laura. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm sorry, we cannot. The doors at the back of the courtroom exploded open. The sound was like a thunderclap, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. Every head in the room turned. Brandon spun around in his chair. What the? But the words died in his throat. Standing in the doorway was a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a federal courthouse. She was in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut into a precise bob and thin-framed glasses. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit like armor, and her heels struck the marble floor with the authority of a judge's gavel. Behind her walked 2 younger associates, a man and a woman in their 30s, both carrying leather briefcases and moving in perfect formation. Richard Thornhill's pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. His face went pale. No, Richard whispered. That's not, she can't be. Who is that? Brandon demanded, looking from his lawyer to the woman striding down the center aisle. Richard, who the hell is that? But Richard didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the woman like she was a ghost. The woman didn't rush. She walked with measured confidence. Each click of her heels echoed in the silent courtroom. Brandon's irritation was quickly shifting to confusion, then to something that felt dangerously close to fear. Because his lawyer, Richard Thornhill, the man who never showed weakness, looked terrified. The woman reached the defense table. She didn't look at Laura. She didn't look at the judge. She turned, slowly and deliberately, and looked directly at Brandon Whitfield. Her expression was calm, almost pleasant, but her eyes were ice. My apologies for the delay, she said, her voice smooth and cultured, projecting effortlessly to every corner of the room. I had to file several emergency motions with the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals this morning. The forensic analysis of your financial disclosures took longer than expected, Mr. Whitfield. Brandon's mouth opened. No sound came out. The woman placed a cream-colored business card on the court reporter's desk. Then she turned to Judge Henderson. Elizabeth Harper, she said clearly, senior partner at Harper, Caldwell, and Sterling of Washington, D.C. I'm entering my appearance as counsel for the respondent, Laura Whitfield. She paused. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, suffocating. Then Elizabeth looked back at Brandon, and her voice dropped to something quieter but infinitely more dangerous. I am also her mother. The words landed like a bomb. Brandon's face went from confusion to shock to something approaching panic. Mother? He stammered, his voice cracking. He pointed at Laura, who was still sitting motionless. You said, Laura? You told me your mother was dead? You said she died when you were in college? Laura finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. I said she was gone from my life, Brandon. I never said she was dead. Elizabeth moved around the defense table, her heels clicking sharply. She placed her briefcase on the table and snapped the latches open with 2 precise clicks. Estranged, Elizabeth said, pulling out a thick folder. My daughter and I have been estranged for 20 years. She left home because she wanted a simple life. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for the family name or the legal legacy. She looked at Brandon. She wanted to escape the pressure of my world, and she succeeded. Until 3 weeks ago, when she called me from a budget inn, crying, telling me that her husband had frozen her bank accounts, thrown her out of her home, and was trying to destroy her in court. Elizabeth's voice hardened. That's when I decided to make an exception to my usual caseload. Richard Thornhill finally found his voice. He stood, his hands visibly shaking. Miss Harper, Richard said, attempting professionalism but landing closer to desperation. It's an honor. I didn't know you were admitted to practice in Ohio. Elizabeth turned to him slowly. Hello, Richard. The way she said his first name, like she was addressing a child who disappointed her, made Richard flinch. I'm admitted in Ohio, D.C., New York, California, and before the United States Supreme Court, Elizabeth said calmly. I generally handle constitutional law and appellate litigation for Fortune 500 companies. But when my daughter called me, weeping, and told me that a mid-level real estate developer with delusions of grandeur was bullying her, she paused, letting the insult land with surgical precision. I decided to take a personal interest in this case. Objection! Brandon shot to his feet, his face flushed. She can't. This is a personal attack, Your Honor. Judge Henderson, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of shock and fascination, banged his gavel. Sit down, Mr. Whitfield. Brandon sat, but his hands were clenched into fists. Judge Henderson looked at Elizabeth Harper with something approaching reverence. Everyone in the legal world knew her name. Elizabeth Harper wasn't just a lawyer, she was a legend. She'd argued 9 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 7. She'd written amicus briefs that changed federal policy. She'd been called the architect by the Washington Post because of her ability to dismantle complex cases and rebuild them into victories. She was the kind of attorney other attorneys feared. Miss Harper, Judge Henderson said carefully, while your reputation certainly precedes you, we are in the middle of a preliminary hearing. Mr. Thornhill has filed a motion for a default judgment. Yes, I read that motion, Elizabeth said, pulling another folder from her briefcase. She walked toward the bench and handed a thick stack of documents to the bailiff. She dropped a duplicate stack onto Richard Thornhill's table with a heavy thud. It was ambitious, Elizabeth said. Richard grabbed the stack and started flipping through it frantically. His face went from pale to gray. Your Honor, Elizabeth continued, Mr. Thornhill's motion claims that my client has no assets, no representation, and no ability to mount a defense. All 3 claims are now moot. She turned back to Brandon. Furthermore, Mr. Whitfield has stated under oath that the marital assets, including the home in Upper Arlington, the investment properties, and the brokerage accounts are protected by a prenuptial agreement signed 8 years ago. Brandon's lawyer shot him a warning look, but Brandon couldn't help himself. That prenup is ironclad, Brandon said. She signed it willingly. Elizabeth removed her glasses slowly. She looked at Brandon like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. Mr. Whitfield, are you familiar with Ohio Revised Code Section 3103.05? Brandon blinked. What? It's the statute that outlines the criteria for invalidating a prenuptial agreement, Elizabeth said calmly. Specifically, subsection B, which addresses coercion and lack of independent legal counsel. She tapped the document on Richard's table. I helped draft that statute in 2007 when I was consulting for the Ohio State Bar Association's Family Law Reform Committee. The courtroom went silent. Elizabeth continued. According to the affidavit my daughter provided this morning, and according to the text messages recovered from cloud backup, Mr. Whitfield threatened to cancel the wedding and publicly humiliate her family if she didn't sign the prenup the night before the ceremony. He also refused to allow her time to consult an attorney. She pulled out another document. Exhibit D, Your Honor. The text messages. Judge Henderson took the exhibit. His eyebrows rose as he read. Brandon stood up, his voice rising to a shout. That's a lie. She's lying. I never threatened her. Mr. Whitfield, sit down, Judge Henderson barked. But Brandon was spiraling. This is insane. She can't just walk in here. And we also recovered the emails, Elizabeth said, her voice cutting through Brandon's panic like a knife. The ones you sent to your accountant discussing how to minimize Laura's access to discovery. Exhibit E. She handed another folder to the bailiff. Richard Thornhill looked like he was about to be sick. Judge Henderson flipped to Exhibit E, his jaw tightened. Your Honor, Richard said weakly, we haven't had time to review this evidence. This is an ambush. Elizabeth turned to him, her expression neutral but her tone lethal. An ambush, Mr. Thornhill. You filed for an emergency default judgment against a woman you believed had no legal representation. You attempted to rush this case through the system before she could mount a defense. And now you're complaining about fairness? She smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Welcome to the other side of your own strategy. Judge Henderson set down the documents and looked at Brandon Whitfield with barely concealed disgust. Miss Harper, I'm inclined to hear your full arguments. But first, he turned to Richard. Mr. Thornhill, did you know about these text messages and emails when you filed your motion? Richard's face was slick with sweat. Your Honor, my client provided financial disclosures that I believe to be accurate. That's not what I asked. Richard swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, I did not know about these communications. Judge Henderson's gaze shifted to Brandon. Mr. Whitfield, did you provide your attorney with complete and accurate information when preparing your financial disclosures? Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Your Honor, Answer the question, Mr. Whitfield. Brandon looked at Richard. Richard looked away. I may have simplified some of the financial structures, Brandon said finally, for clarity. Simplified, Judge Henderson repeated flatly. Elizabeth Harper stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to address the issue of Mr. Whitfield's financial disclosures now, since we're on the subject. Judge Henderson nodded. Proceed. Elizabeth opened her briefcase and pulled out a third, even thicker binder. Brandon's stomach dropped. Over the past 3 weeks, Elizabeth said, my forensic accounting team, who normally work with the Department of Justice tracking financial crimes, has been analyzing Mr. Whitfield's business structure. She dropped the binder onto the defense table. The sound echoed like a gavel strike. According to Mr. Whitfield's sworn financial affidavit, filed with this court on March 28th, his net worth is approximately $6.2 million. Elizabeth paused. That is a lie. Brandon shot to his feet. I didn't lie. Those numbers are... Sit down, Judge Henderson roared. Brandon sat. Elizabeth continued, her voice calm and measured. Mr. Whitfield has been funneling marital assets into a series of shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. The primary entity is Whitfield Ventures, LLC, which holds undisclosed properties in Dublin, Scottsdale, and Miami. She pulled out a summary sheet and held it up. The actual value of the marital estate is not $6.2 million, Your Honor. She looked directly at Brandon. It's $18.7 million. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Diane Whitfield's face went white. Nicole grabbed her mother's arm. Brandon was shaking his head, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. Elizabeth turned back to the judge. And since Mr. Whitfield failed to disclose these assets on his sworn financial affidavit, she paused for emphasis. That constitutes felony perjury under Ohio Revised Code Section 2921.11. Judge Henderson removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked up, his expression was one of cold fury. Mr. Whitfield, the judge said slowly, you lied under oath in my courtroom. Brandon's voice came out as a whisper. I didn't. You committed fraud. Your Honor, I can explain. I am referring this case to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for criminal investigation. The gavel came down. The sound reverberated through courtroom 4B like a death knell. Brandon slumped in his chair, his face ashen. From the gallery, Diane whispered frantically to Nicole, "We need to leave. We need to leave right now." But it was too late. Elizabeth Harper wasn't done. She turned back to Judge Henderson, her expression calm, but her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of legal expertise. "Your Honor, in light of Mr. Whitfield's perjury and financial fraud, I'm filing an emergency motion for immediate protective orders." She handed another document to the bailiff. "I'm requesting that all marital assets be frozen, pending a full forensic audit. I'm also requesting immediate temporary spousal support in the amount of $15,000 per month to be paid from Mr. Whitfield's previously undisclosed accounts." Judge Henderson read the motion quickly. Then he looked up at Brandon Whitfield. Motion granted. The second gavel strike landed like a final blow. Brandon's world, the empire he'd built on lies and manipulation, began to crumble. And in that moment, sitting at the defense table with her mother beside her, Laura Whitfield finally allowed herself to breathe. The laughter had stopped when the doors opened. And now, justice had arrived. Judge Henderson called for a 15-minute recess. The courtroom erupted into chaos, reporters whispering frantically into phones, spectators murmuring in shock, bailiffs trying to maintain order. But through it all, Elizabeth Harper remained perfectly calm, organizing her files with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Laura sat beside her mother, her hands still folded on the table, but now there was something different in her posture. Not triumph, not yet, but relief. The kind of relief that comes when you've been holding your breath for years, and finally, you're allowed to exhale. "Are you okay?" Elizabeth asked quietly, not looking up from her documents. Laura nodded. "I think so." "Good, because this is about to get worse for him." Across the aisle, Brandon was hunched over the plaintiff's table, his head in his hands. Richard Thornhill stood a few feet away, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. From the gallery, Diane Whitfield attempted to approach Brandon, but a bailiff stopped her. "Ma'am, please remain seated during recess." Diane's face was pale, her usual composure cracking. "That's my son. I need to speak to my son." "You'll have to wait until after the hearing, ma'am." Diane sat back down heavily. Nicole was already scrolling through her phone, probably texting everyone she knew to distance herself from the disaster unfolding in courtroom 4B. When the 15 minutes ended, Judge Henderson returned to the bench with the air of a man who'd seen too much and had run out of patience for lies. "Be seated," he said flatly. The room settled into tense silence. Judge Henderson looked at Richard Thornhill. "Mr. Thornhill, does your client wish to make a statement regarding the financial disclosures?" Richard stood slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 15 minutes. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a continuance to review the evidence Miss Harper has presented. My client—" "Request denied," Judge Henderson said. "You wanted to proceed immediately, Mr. Thornhill. We're proceeding." Richard sat back down, defeated. The judge turned to Elizabeth. "Miss Harper, you've established probable cause for financial fraud. What else?" Elizabeth stood, buttoning her suit jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. Before we discuss asset division, I'd like to address the prenuptial agreement Mr. Whitfield has been using as the foundation of his case." Brandon lifted his head. "The prenup is valid. She signed it, willingly." Elizabeth turned to him. "Did I address you, Mr. Whitfield?" Brandon opened his mouth, but Richard grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. Elizabeth continued. "The prenuptial agreement in question was signed on June 14, 2017, exactly one night before Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield's wedding ceremony." She pulled out a document and handed it to the bailiff. "This is the prenup. All 43 pages of it. Complex legal language, multiple schedules, appendices outlining asset division, spousal support waiver, and inheritance rights." She paused. Laura Whitfield was presented with this document at 9:47 p.m. the night before her wedding. Mr. Whitfield told her she had until midnight to sign it, or he would cancel the ceremony. "That's not true," Brandon shouted, half rising from his chair. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. "Mr. Whitfield, I will have you removed if you cannot control yourself." Elizabeth didn't even glance at Brandon. She simply continued. "Exhibit D, Your Honor. The text messages I mentioned earlier contains the following exchange between Brandon Whitfield and Laura Bennett on June 14, 2017, at 10:23 p.m. She read from the document in her hand. "Brandon Whitfield, we're not getting married tomorrow unless you sign this." "I'm serious, Laura." Laura Bennett, Brandon, I don't understand half of these terms. Can I at least call a lawyer? Brandon Whitfield. It's almost 10:30 at night. What lawyer is going to be available? Just sign it. Don't you trust me? Laura Bennett. Of course I trust you, but… Brandon Whitfield. Then prove it. Sign the paperwork, or I'm calling my parents right now and telling them the wedding is off. And I'll make sure everyone knows it was because you didn't trust me. Elizabeth lowered the document and looked at Judge Henderson. That, Your Honor, is textbook coercion. The courtroom was silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her hands frozen over the keys. Judge Henderson leaned forward. Mr. Whitfield, did you threaten to cancel your wedding if Mrs. Whitfield didn't sign the prenuptial agreement? Brandon's face was red. Your Honor. We were both stressed, wedding jitters. I didn't mean… Answer the question. Yes or no? Brandon looked at Richard. Richard's expression said, You're on your own. Yes, Brandon said finally, but I was just trying to protect my assets. That's what prenups are for. Protection, yes, Elizabeth said. Coercion, no. She pulled out another document. Ohio Revised Code Section 3103.05 states that a prenuptial agreement is unenforceable if it was signed under duress, coercion, or without the opportunity for independent legal counsel. She held up 3 fingers. Mr. Whitfield's actions meet all 3 criteria. First, duress. He threatened to cancel the wedding, humiliating Laura and her family. Second, coercion. He used emotional manipulation. Don't you trust me? To pressure her into signing. Third, lack of independent counsel. He gave her less than 3 hours to review a 43-page legal document and explicitly discouraged her from consulting an attorney. Elizabeth placed the document on the table. Under Ohio law, this prenuptial agreement is void. Brandon's lawyer finally spoke up. Your Honor, my client's intentions were not malicious. This is standard practice in high-asset marriages. Standard practice? Elizabeth interrupted, her voice sharp. Mr. Thornhill, in what universe is threatening to publicly humiliate your fiancé the night before your wedding considered standard practice? Richard fell silent. Elizabeth turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'm not just arguing that this prenup should be invalidated. I'm arguing that it was never valid to begin with. My client signed under duress, without legal representation, and under threat of emotional and social harm. She pulled out yet another folder. I've also obtained statements from 3 witnesses, Laura's maid of honor, her aunt, and the wedding planner, all of whom testified that Laura was visibly distressed the night before the wedding. The maid of honor statement says, and I quote, Laura was crying in the bridal suite. She said Brandon was making her sign papers she didn't understand, and she felt like she had no choice. Judge Henderson read the statements carefully. Then he looked up at Brandon Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, this court finds that the prenuptial agreement signed on June 14, 2017, was executed under duress and without proper legal counsel. The agreement is hereby declared void and unenforceable. The gavel came down. Brandon's face went white. No, that's Your Honor. That prenup protects everything. The house, the properties, the accounts, which, according to Miss Harper's evidence, you've been systematically hiding anyway, Judge Henderson said coldly. Brandon slumped back in his chair, his hands shaking. From the gallery, Diane Whitfield let out a small, strangled sound. Nicole had her face buried in her hands. Elizabeth sat down beside Laura. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. Laura looked up at her mother, eyes glistening with tears. Thank you, Laura whispered. Elizabeth nodded once. We're not done yet. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses and looked at both parties. Given the invalidation of the prenuptial agreement, this court will now treat all assets acquired during the marriage as marital property, subject to equitable division under Ohio law. Richard Thornhill stood weakly. Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to… No, Judge Henderson said. We're finishing this today. Miss Harper, do you have anything else? Elizabeth stood. Yes, Your Honor. Now that we've established that the prenup is void and that Mr. Whitfield has committed financial fraud, I'd like to address his claims about my client's contributions to the marriage. She pulled out another folder, thinner this time, but somehow more dangerous. Mr. Whitfield has repeatedly stated both in his filings and in this courtroom that Laura contributed nothing to the marriage, that she was, in his words, financially dependent and professionally inactive. Brandon looked up, some of his arrogance returning. Because it's true. She didn't work. She didn't earn money. She was a housewife. Elizabeth turned to him slowly. Mr. Whitfield, are you familiar with the property management company that oversees your rental units in Dublin and Grandview? Brandon blinked. What? Yes. Whitfield Property Management. I run it. Do you? Elizabeth asked. Because according to the incorporation documents, the company was registered in 2018. And according to the email records we recovered, the person who actually managed the day-to-day operations, tenant communications, maintenance scheduling, lease renewals was not you. She pulled out a stack of printed emails. It was Laura. Brandon's mouth fell open. Elizabeth continued. For 3 years, from 2018 to 2021, Laura managed 12 rental properties under the Whitfield Property Management umbrella. She handled tenant complaints, coordinated repairs, negotiated lease terms, and even filed the quarterly tax documents. She placed the emails on the table. All while you took credit for it. Judge Henderson leaned forward, scanning the emails Elizabeth had submitted. Miss Harper, are you saying Mrs. Whitfield was operating a property management company without compensation? That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. Mr. Whitfield claimed the business income on his personal tax returns. He told his accountant in this court that he was the sole operator. But the evidence shows that Laura was doing the work while Brandon took the profit. Brandon stood up, his face flushed. She was helping me. That's what wives do. She wasn't an employee. No, she was a partner, Elizabeth said. A partner you've systematically erased from the record. A partner whose contributions you've denied, minimized, and mocked. She turned to Judge Henderson. Your Honor, under Ohio marital property law, contributions to a marriage are not limited to financial income. They include homemaking, child-rearing, and critically unpaid labor that contributes to a spouse's business or career. She held up the emails. Laura Whitfield didn't just contribute to this marriage. She built part of the financial foundation that Mr. Whitfield is now trying to hide. Judge Henderson read through the emails carefully. Then he set them down and looked at Brandon Whitfield with something approaching disgust. Mr. Whitfield, did your wife manage your rental properties? Brandon hesitated. She helped. Did she handle tenant communications? Sometimes. Did she coordinate repairs and maintenance? I mean, yes, but did you compensate her for this work? Brandon's silence was answer enough. Judge Henderson shook his head. This court finds that Mrs. Whitfield made substantial, uncompensated contributions to the marital estate. Those contributions will be factored into the division of assets. He looked at Elizabeth. Miss Harper, what are you requesting? Elizabeth stood tall. Your Honor, given the evidence of fraud, coercion, and uncompensated labor, I'm requesting the following. First, an equal division of all marital assets, including the properties Mr. Whitfield attempted to hide. Second, immediate temporary spousal support of $15,000 per month, retroactive to the date Mr. Whitfield froze the joint accounts. Third, full reimbursement of my client's legal fees. And fourth, a formal forensic audit of all Whitfield-related business entities to ensure full financial disclosure. Judge Henderson nodded. Granted on all counts. The gavel struck. Brandon Whitfield's carefully constructed empire built on lies, manipulation, and the erasure of his wife's contributions collapsed in an instant. He sat motionless, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume. His arrogance had evaporated. His confidence was gone. All that remained was a man who'd underestimated the woman he thought he could erase. From the gallery, Diane Whitfield stood abruptly and walked out, her face hidden behind her hands. Nicole followed, her phone already pressed to her ear. Richard Thornhill gathered his files in silence. He didn't look at Brandon. He didn't offer reassurance. He simply walked away. And Laura Whitfield, sitting beside her mother in a courtroom that had tried to destroy her, finally allowed herself to cry. Not tears of sadness. Tears of relief. Because silence hadn't been surrender. It had been strategy. And she had won. Judge Henderson called for another brief recess. When proceedings resumed 20 minutes later, the energy in courtroom 4B had shifted. What had started as a routine divorce hearing had become something else entirely. A public unraveling of fraud, lies, and manipulation. Brandon sat at the plaintiff's table, his expensive suit rumpled, his confidence shattered. He kept glancing at the doors as if considering an escape. Richard Thornhill sat beside him, but the distance between them had grown. Richard's body language screamed dissociation. He was physically present but mentally calculating his exit strategy. Elizabeth Harper stood at the defense table, utterly composed. She opened her briefcase and pulled out the thickest binder, yet easily 3 inches of paper bound in black leather. "Your Honor," Elizabeth said, "I'd like to address the full scope of Mr. Whitfield's financial deception." Judge Henderson nodded wearily. "Proceed." Elizabeth walked to the center of the courtroom, holding the binder like evidence at a criminal trial. "Over the past 3 weeks, my forensic accounting team has conducted a comprehensive audit of Mr. Whitfield's financial activities during the marriage. What we discovered goes far beyond simple asset concealment." She opened the binder to a marked page. Mr. Whitfield didn't just hide money. He created an elaborate network of shell companies, dummy corporations, and offshore accounts specifically designed to evade taxation, avoid equitable distribution, and commit fraud. Brandon's face went red. "That's insane. I'm a legitimate businessman. Everything I do is legal." "Is it?" Elizabeth asked calmly. She pulled out a document. "Let's start with Whitfield Ventures LLC, the Delaware company we discussed earlier. According to the incorporation documents, this company was formed in 2019. Its stated purpose is real estate investment and development." She held up the document. "In reality, Whitfield Ventures is a shell company with no employees, no office, and no legitimate business activity. Its sole purpose is to hold assets that Mr. Whitfield wanted to hide from his wife and from the IRS." "Objection." Richard Thornhill stood. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations. We'd need to see the accounting methodology." "It's all here," Elizabeth said, handing a copy of the forensic report to the bailiff. She dropped another copy onto Richard's table with a heavy thud. 247 pages of transaction history, corporate filings, and banking records. Feel free to review it." Richard opened the report. His face went pale. Elizabeth continued. "Through Whitfield Ventures, Mr. Whitfield purchased 3 properties that were never disclosed as marital assets. The first is a luxury condo in Scottsdale, Arizona, purchased in 2020 for $890,000. She projected an image on the courtroom screen, a sleek modern condo with mountain views. The second is a vacation property in Miami Beach, purchased in 2021 for $1.2 million. Another image appeared. And the third is a commercial property in Phoenix, a strip mall, purchased in 2022 for $2.4 million. Judge Henderson leaned forward, studying the images. "Mr. Whitfield, were you aware you were required to disclose these properties in your financial affidavit?" Brandon opened his mouth, but Elizabeth cut him off. "He was aware, Your Honor, because I have the email from his accountant explicitly reminding him of the disclosure requirements." She pulled out another document. This email, dated March 15th, 2 weeks before Mr. Whitfield filed his financial affidavit, is from Theodore Grant, Mr. Whitfield's accountant. It reads, and I quote, "Brandon, remember that all real property, regardless of how it's held, must be disclosed in the divorce filing. Even properties under LLC ownership. The court will find out eventually." Elizabeth looked up. Mr. Whitfield responded, "She'll never think to look. Keep the LLCs off the main schedule." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Judge Henderson's face darkened. "Mr. Whitfield, did you instruct your accountant to conceal assets from this court?" Brandon shot to his feet. "That's taken out of context. I was just—" "Just what?" Elizabeth interrupted. "Just committing perjury? Just defrauding your wife? Just breaking federal tax law?" "I didn't break any laws," Brandon shouted. "Then explain the offshore accounts," Elizabeth said calmly. Brandon froze. Elizabeth pulled out another section of the binder. "In addition to the domestic properties, Mr. Whitfield maintains 3 bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, held under the name of a nominee corporation called Summit Holdings International." She projected bank statements onto the screen. "The total balance across these 3 accounts is $3.7 million. The gallery exploded in shocked whispers. Someone in the back row let out a low whistle. Brandon was shaking his head frantically. "Those aren't my accounts. I don't even know what Summit Holdings is." Elizabeth smiled. "You don't?" She pulled out another document. "This is the incorporation certificate for Summit Holdings International, filed with the Cayman Islands Registrar of Companies in August 2020. It lists the beneficial owner as Brandon James Whitfield, residential address 2447 Kensington Lane, Upper Arlington, Ohio. She held up the document for the court to see. "That's your address, isn't it, Mr. Whitfield?" Brandon's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That must be a mistake. Someone must have used my name." "Someone used your name, your address, your passport number, and your signature?" Elizabeth asked. "That's quite a coincidence." She walked closer to him. "And hear me out, you opened these accounts yourself, lied about them under oath, and are now perjuring yourself again by claiming they don't exist." Brandon's lawyer grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, but Brandon yanked himself free. "Fine," Brandon shouted, his voice cracking. "Fine, yes, those are my accounts. But that money is mine. I earned it. I built the business. She doesn't deserve a penny of it." The courtroom went silent. Elizabeth turned slowly to Judge Henderson. "Your Honor, I believe Mr. Whitfield just confessed to perjury." Judge Henderson removed his glasses and set them on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but lethal. "Mr. Whitfield, you just admitted under oath that you own offshore accounts you previously swore did not exist. Do you understand what you've just done?" Brandon's face went from red to white. He looked at Richard Thornhill desperately. "Richard, do something." Richard Thornhill stood slowly. He looked at Brandon, then at Judge Henderson, then at Elizabeth Harper. "Your Honor," Richard said carefully, "I need to request a recess to consult with my client regarding—" "Denied," Judge Henderson said. "Sit down, Mr. Thornhill." Richard sat. Judge Henderson continued. "Mr. Whitfield, based on the evidence presented by Miss Harper and your own admission moments ago, I am making the following findings. 1. You have committed perjury by filing a false financial affidavit with this court. 2. You have engaged in financial fraud by concealing marital assets. 3. You have potentially violated federal tax law by maintaining undisclosed offshore accounts." The judge picked up his gavel. "All assets identified by Miss Harper, the properties, the accounts, the shell companies are hereby frozen. You are prohibited from transferring, selling, or accessing any funds pending a full criminal investigation. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office and to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." Brandon slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face. From the gallery, Diane Whitfield stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. He's being railroaded." Judge Henderson's gaze snapped to her. "Ma'am, sit down or I'll have you removed." Diane sat, her hands trembling. Judge Henderson turned to Richard Thornhill. "Mr. Thornhill, does your client have anything else to say?" Richard stood. His voice was hollow. "Your Honor, I need to request a private consultation with my client." "Fine. You have 5 minutes. Use the conference room." Richard gathered his files and gestured for Brandon to follow him. They disappeared through a side door. In the gallery, Nicole Whitfield leaned over to her mother. "This is a disaster. We need to leave, now." "We can't just leave," Diane hissed. "He's your brother." "He lied to us," Nicole whispered. "About everything. If the IRS starts investigating, they'll look at the whole family. Mom, we need to distance ourselves." Diane's face crumpled. "He's my son." 5 minutes later, Richard Thornhill emerged from the conference room alone. Judge Henderson frowned. "Where's your client?" Richard's expression was grim. "Your Honor, I need to formally request withdrawal as counsel. I've just learned information that creates an irreconcilable conflict of interest. I cannot ethically continue representing Mr. Whitfield." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. "Order." He looked at Richard. "Mr. Thornhill, are you saying you're abandoning your client in the middle of a hearing?" "I'm saying I cannot represent someone who has lied to me, lied to this court, and put me at risk of professional sanctions," Richard said firmly. "I'm filing a motion to withdraw immediately." Judge Henderson sighed. "Motion granted. Mr. Whitfield, you now have 30 seconds to get back in here, or I'm proceeding without you." The conference room door opened. Brandon walked out slowly, his face ashen. He looked like a man who'd just been told his execution date. He sat down at the plaintiff's table alone. No lawyer, no support, no way out. Judge Henderson looked at him with something approaching pity. "Mr. Whitfield, you now have no legal representation. Do you wish to request a continuance to secure new counsel?" Brandon's voice was barely a whisper. How long? 2 weeks. Brandon closed his eyes. Fine. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. This hearing is continued until April 24th. Mr. Whitfield, you are ordered to surrender your passport to the bailiff before you leave this courthouse. Do you understand? Brandon nodded mutely. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Brandon sat alone at the table, staring at nothing. His lawyer had abandoned him. His assets were frozen. His lies had been exposed. And across the aisle, Laura Whitfield sat with her mother, finally free. The empire Brandon had built on cruelty had crumbled, and he had no one to blame but himself. 2 weeks later, on April 24th, courtroom 4B was packed. Word had spread about the Whitfield divorce. Local reporters filled the back rows. Legal bloggers live tweeted from the gallery. Even a few law students had shown up to watch Elizabeth Harper in action. Brandon Whitfield sat at the plaintiff's table with a new attorney, a nervous-looking solo practitioner named Paul Brennan, who'd agreed to take the case only after Brandon liquidated his watch collection to pay the retainer. Elizabeth Harper sat beside Laura, serene and prepared. She had 3 additional bankers, boxes of evidence stacked beside the defense table. Judge Henderson entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. We're here for the continuation of Whitfield v. Whitfield, Judge Henderson said. Mr. Brennan, I understand you're now representing the petitioner? Paul Brennan stood awkwardly. Yes, Your Honor. I entered my appearance yesterday. And are you familiar with the evidence Miss Harper presented at the last hearing? I am, Your Honor. My client disputes some of the characterizations, but does he dispute the bank accounts? Brennan hesitated. No, Your Honor. Does he dispute the shell companies? No, Your Honor. Then let's move forward. Miss Harper, I believe you had additional evidence to present? Elizabeth stood. Yes, Your Honor. At the last hearing, we established that Mr. Whitfield committed fraud by hiding marital assets. Today, I'd like to address who helped him do it. Brandon's head snapped up. What? Elizabeth opened one of the banker's boxes. Your Honor, financial fraud of this scale doesn't happen in isolation. Mr. Whitfield had assistance. Specifically, he had help from members of his immediate family. From the gallery, Diane Whitfield gasped. That's absurd. Judge Henderson banged his gavel. Ma'am, you are not part of these proceedings. Remain silent or leave. Diane's face flushed, but she sat back down. Beside her, Nicole looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Elizabeth pulled out a document. In 2021, Mr. Whitfield transferred $400,000 from a joint marital account into one of his shell companies, Whitfield Ventures, LLC. The person who facilitated that transfer was Nicole Whitfield, his sister. Nicole shot to her feet. That's not true. Judge Henderson's gavel came down. Young lady, sit down. Elizabeth continued calmly. Nicole Whitfield is listed as the registered agent for Whitfield Ventures. She signed the incorporation documents. She also signed the bank authorization forms that allowed funds to move from the marital account into the LLC. She projected copies of the documents onto the courtroom screen. There, clear as day, was Nicole's signature. Nicole stood frozen, her face white. I didn't know what I was signing. Brandon said it was just paperwork for his business. He said it was routine. You didn't know you were signing documents to move $400,000? Elizabeth asked. He told me it was a business expense. And you didn't think to ask why your brother needed you to sign documents for his business expenses? Nicole's mouth opened and closed. She looked at her mother desperately. Mom, I didn't know, I swear. But Diane wasn't looking at her daughter. She was staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Elizabeth turned to Judge Henderson. Your Honor, Nicole Whitfield's involvement may have been unknowing, but it was still material. She facilitated the transfer of marital funds into a concealed account. Judge Henderson looked at Nicole. Miss Whitfield, did you sign these documents? Nicole's voice was barely audible. Yes. Did you receive any compensation for doing so? Nicole hesitated. Then quietly, Brandon paid off my credit card debt, about $30,000. The gallery erupted. Judge Henderson banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! Order! Elizabeth pulled out another document. There's more, Your Honor. In addition to Nicole's involvement, there's the matter of Diane Whitfield. Diane stood up, her voice shaking. I had nothing to do with this. Nothing. Sit down, Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Henderson roared, or I will have you removed and charged with contempt. Diane sat, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth continued. Diane Whitfield is listed as a co-signer on 2 of the Cayman Islands bank accounts. Her signature appears on the account opening documents dated August 2020. She projected the banking documents. There, alongside Brandon's signature, was Diane's elegant, unmistakable. Diane's face went from red to ashen. I signed those because Brandon said he needed a family member for estate planning. He said it was for inheritance purposes. You signed documents for Cayman Islands bank accounts and didn't ask why? Elizabeth asked. He's my son, Diane cried. I trusted him. You trusted him to commit financial fraud, Elizabeth said quietly, and you enabled it. Judge Henderson leaned forward. Mrs. Whitfield, did you know these accounts existed? Diane was crying openly now. Yes, but I thought they were legal. I thought it was just smart financial planning. Did you know Mr. Whitfield was hiding them from his wife? Diane didn't answer. Mrs. Whitfield, answer the question. Yes, Diane whispered. Yes, I knew. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Reporters were typing frantically. Someone in the gallery shouted, Unbelievable! Judge Henderson banged his gavel so hard the sound echoed like gunfire. Order! I will clear this courtroom if you cannot maintain decorum. The noise subsided. Judge Henderson looked at Diane and Nicole, both of whom were crying. Then he looked at Brandon, who had his head in his hands. This court finds that both Diane Whitfield and Nicole Whitfield knowingly participated in the concealment of marital assets, Judge Henderson said. I am referring both of them to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office for investigation into potential criminal conspiracy and financial fraud. Diane let out a wail. Nicole buried her face in her hands. Brandon stood up, his voice raw. Your Honor, please. They didn't know what they were doing. I told them it was legal. Don't punish them for my mistakes. It was the first time Brandon had shown any hint of remorse, but it was too late. Judge Henderson looked at him coldly. Mr. Whitfield, your mother and sister are adults who signed legal documents. They are responsible for their actions, just as you are responsible for yours. He turned to the bailiff. Escort Mrs. Whitfield and Miss Whitfield out of the courtroom. They are not to return to these proceedings. 2 bailiffs approached Diane and Nicole. Diane was sobbing uncontrollably. Nicole looked like she was in shock. As they were let out, Nicole turned back to Brandon. This is your fault, she screamed. You ruined us. You ruined everything. Brandon didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the table, his expensive suit now looking like a costume from a play that had ended badly. When the doors closed behind Diane and Nicole, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Judge Henderson looked at Elizabeth. Miss Harper, do you have anything else? Just one more thing, Your Honor. Elizabeth walked back to the defense table and placed a hand on Laura's shoulder. Throughout these proceedings, Mr. Whitfield has attempted to paint my client as someone who contributed nothing to the marriage, someone who was dependent, passive, and undeserving. But as this court has seen, that narrative is a lie. She looked at Brandon. Laura Whitfield was not absent from this marriage. She was erased, systematically, deliberately, and cruelly. And now, the people who helped erase her are facing the consequences of their actions. Elizabeth sat down beside her daughter. Judge Henderson nodded slowly. Noted, Miss Harper. He looked at Brandon Whitfield, a man who'd arrived at this courthouse 2 weeks ago with arrogance and entitlement, and who now sat alone, abandoned by his family, his lawyer, and his lies. Mr. Brennan, Judge Henderson said, does your client have anything to say before I render my final rulings? Paul Brennan looked at Brandon. Brandon shook his head. No, Your Honor, Brennan said quietly. Judge Henderson picked up his gavel. Then let's finish this. Judge Henderson shuffled the papers in front of him, organizing them with the methodical precision of someone preparing to deliver a verdict that would reshape lives. Before I issue my final rulings on asset division and spousal support, Judge Henderson said, I want to address one claim that has persisted throughout these proceedings. He looked directly at Brandon. Mr. Whitfield, you have repeatedly stated both in your filings and in open court that your wife contributed nothing to this marriage, that she was financially dependent, professionally inactive, and essentially dead weight. Brandon shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Judge Henderson continued. Miss Harper has presented evidence to the contrary, but I want to hear from you directly, Mr. Whitfield. Do you maintain that position? Brandon glanced at his attorney, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Brandon stood slowly. Your Honor, I don't mean to be cruel, but yes, Laura didn't work during our marriage. She didn't bring in income. She spent my money, lived in my house, and enjoyed the lifestyle I provided. I'm not saying she was a bad person. I'm just saying she didn't contribute financially. The words hung in the air like poison. Laura sat perfectly still at the defense table. Her hands folded. She didn't flinch, didn't react. Her expression remained calm, dignified. Elizabeth Harper stood. Your Honor, may I respond? Please. Elizabeth walked to the center of the courtroom. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Mr. Whitfield's statement is not only false, it's insulting, and I can prove it. She opened another file. Let's start with the property management work we discussed previously. For 3 years, Laura managed 12 rental properties. She handled tenant communications, coordinated repairs, processed lease renewals, and maintained occupancy rates above 90%. She pulled out a spreadsheet. The average property manager in Ohio charges 10% of monthly rental income for these services. Based on Mr. Whitfield's rental income, during those 3 years, Laura's labor was worth approximately $118,000. She let that number sink in. Mr. Whitfield paid her nothing. Elizabeth pulled out more documents. But it doesn't stop there. In 2019, Mr. Whitfield was negotiating the purchase of a commercial property in Westerville. The deal was falling apart because the seller wanted environmental guarantees that Mr. Whitfield couldn't provide. She projected an email chain onto the screen. This email, dated September 2019, shows Laura researching environmental compliance requirements, drafting the necessary disclosures, and ultimately saving the deal. That property is now worth $1.8 million. Elizabeth looked at Brandon. Did you credit your wife for that work? Brandon said nothing. No, Elizabeth answered for him. You told your business partners you handled it personally. She pulled out another document. In 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, Mr. Whitfield's rental properties were hemorrhaging money. Tenants couldn't pay rent. Vacancies were increasing. Mr. Whitfield was considering selling at a loss. She projected another email. Laura proposed a rent deferral program allowing tenants to delay payments without penalties, preserving occupancy while maintaining tenant relationships. She drafted the legal agreements herself, researched federal assistance programs, and personally called every tenant to explain the options. Elizabeth paused. That strategy saved Mr. Whitfield's rental portfolio, and when the market recovered, his properties were fully occupied while his competitors were liquidating. The estimated value of that contribution? Over $200,000 in preserved equity. She turned to Judge Henderson. Laura Whitfield didn't just contribute to this marriage, Your Honor. She was a full partner in building the wealth Mr. Whitfield now claims as his sole achievement. Elizabeth pulled out a final set of documents. And then there's this. She held up a bound report. Testimonies from 3 former tenants and 2 maintenance contractors who worked with Mr. Whitfield's properties. All of them state the same thing. They rarely dealt with Mr. Whitfield. They dealt with Laura. She read from one of the statements. Mrs. Whitfield was the most professional property manager I've ever worked with. She responded to maintenance requests within hours, negotiated fair rates, and always treated us with respect. I didn't even know Mr. Whitfield owned the properties until the divorce was announced. I thought she was the owner. Elizabeth set down the report. Your Honor, Mr. Whitfield's claim that Laura contributed nothing is not just wrong. It's a calculated erasure of a woman who built his empire alongside him and was then discarded when she was no longer useful. The courtroom was silent. Judge Henderson looked at the evidence in front of him. Then he looked at Brandon. Mr. Whitfield, having reviewed the evidence presented by Miss Harper, I find your characterization of your wife's contributions to be not only inaccurate, but willfully dishonest. Brandon's face flushed. Your Honor, I'm not finished, Judge Henderson said sharply. Mrs. Whitfield managed your properties, saved your business deals, and preserved your financial assets during a global pandemic. She did this without compensation, without recognition, and without basic respect from you. He picked up his gavel. This court finds that Laura Whitfield made substantial and material contributions to the marital estate. Those contributions will be given full weight in the division of assets. Elizabeth returned to the defense table and sat beside Laura. For the first time since the hearing began, she allowed herself a small smile. She placed her hand gently on Laura's shoulder and squeezed. Laura looked up at her mother, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Elizabeth nodded. "You never needed me to prove your worth, Laura, but I'm glad I could make him see it." Judge Henderson continued. Based on the totality of the evidence, this court makes the following final rulings. First, all marital assets, including those concealed by Mr. Whitfield, shall be divided equally between the parties. This includes the primary residence, the rental properties, the commercial holdings, and the offshore accounts. Second, Mr. Whitfield shall pay spousal support in the amount of $15,000 per month for a period of 7 years equivalent to the length of the marriage. Third, Mr. Whitfield shall reimburse Mrs. Whitfield for all legal fees incurred in this proceeding. Based on Ms. Harper's submitted invoice, that amount is $127,000. Brandon's new lawyer let out a quiet groan. Fourth, all assets shall remain frozen until a complete forensic audit is completed and approved by this court. And fifth, given the evidence of perjury, fraud, and financial misconduct, I am formally recommending that the Franklin County prosecutor pursue criminal charges against Brandon Whitfield, Diane Whitfield, and Nicole Whitfield. Judge Henderson looked at Brandon one final time. "Mr. Whitfield, you entered this courtroom believing your wealth and status made you untouchable. You mocked your wife for being nothing. But the truth is, you were nothing without her. And now, you have nothing left." He raised his gavel. "This marriage is hereby dissolved. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck with finality. And Brandon Whitfield, real estate developer, wealthy businessman, arrogant husband, sat in courtroom 4B, completely alone. His family had turned on him. His assets were seized. His reputation was destroyed. And across the aisle, Laura Whitfield stood up, dignified and free, ready to rebuild the life he'd tried to erase. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't say a word. She simply walked out of the courtroom with her mother beside her, and left Brandon Whitfield sitting in the wreckage of his own making. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning in Cincinnati, Ohio, Laura Whitfield stood in front of a small brick building in the historic Over-the-Rhine neighborhood. The sign above the door read, Whitfield Design Studio. She'd kept the name, not because she wanted to hold on to the marriage, but because she'd earned it. That name represented 7 years of invisible labor, strategic patience, and quiet strength. She wasn't giving it up. The studio was small but bright, with large windows that let in morning light. Inside, Laura had set up a drafting table, a small office area, and a gallery wall displaying her interior design concepts. She specialized in residential redesign, helping people transform spaces that no longer serve them. It felt symbolic. The bell above the door chimed. Laura looked up from her sketchpad to see Elizabeth Harper walking in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I brought reinforcements," Elizabeth said, handing Laura a cup. "You didn't have to drive down from D.C., Laura said, but she smiled as she took the coffee. "I had a case in Dayton. It was on the way." Elizabeth looked around the studio approvingly. "This is beautiful, Laura. Really beautiful." "It's small." "It's yours," Elizabeth corrected. "That's what matters." They sat together at the small consultation table near the window. For a while, neither spoke. They just sat in comfortable silence, watching the street outside slowly wake up. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "Have you heard anything about Brandon?" Elizabeth nodded. "He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of financial fraud last month. He's facing 18 months in federal prison. His mother and sister took plea deals, probation, and restitution." Laura absorbed that information quietly. "And the business?" "Liquidated. The court-appointed trustee sold everything to pay back taxes, legal fees, and the settlement. Brandon walked away with about $200,000. Everything else went to creditors and to you." Laura took a sip of her coffee. "I don't feel happy about it." "You shouldn't," Elizabeth said. "This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. There's a difference." "I know." Laura paused. "I just keep thinking about who he used to be, or who I thought he was." "He was always this person," Elizabeth said gently. "You just couldn't see it until you stopped looking for who you wanted him to be and started seeing who he actually was." Laura nodded. She looked at her mother, really looked at her. "Why did you come? When I called you that day, we hadn't spoken in 20 years. Elizabeth set down her coffee. "Because you're my daughter. And because I taught you to be independent, to be strong, to stand on your own, and then I let you believe that meant you had to do everything alone." She reached across the table and took Laura's hand. When you called me crying, telling me you had nowhere to go and no way to fight back, I realized I'd failed you. Not by letting you leave, but by not making sure you knew you could always come back. Laura's eyes filled with tears. I thought you'd be disappointed in me, for staying as long as I did, for letting him control me. Disappointed? Elizabeth shook her head. Laura, you survived, you documented, you waited for the right moment. That's not weakness. That's strategy. You did exactly what I would have done. You would have left sooner. Maybe, Elizabeth admitted. Or maybe I would have stayed like you did, gathering evidence and waiting for him to hang himself. Either way, you made it out. That's what matters. They sat in silence again, but this time, it felt different, lighter, like something that had been broken was finally healing. The bell chimed again. A young couple walked in, looking around curiously. Hi, the woman said. Are you Laura Whitfield? We saw your ad in Cincinnati Magazine. We're looking for help redesigning our condo. Laura stood, smoothing her shirt. She glanced at her mother, who smiled encouragingly. Yes, Laura said. I'm Laura. Come in. Let's talk about what you need. As Laura walked the couple through her portfolio, Elizabeth watched from the consultation table. She saw her daughter smile genuinely for the first time in years. Saw her speak with confidence, with expertise, with the quiet authority of someone who knew their worth. Elizabeth finished her coffee and stood to leave. She caught Laura's eye and gestured toward the door. I'll let you work. Laura nodded gratefully. Outside, Elizabeth stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the sign, Whitfield Design Studio. She pulled out her phone and took a picture. Then she sent it to Laura with a message. Proud of you. Always have been, always will be. Mom. Inside the studio, Laura's phone buzzed. She glanced at the message and smiled. Then she turned back to her clients and got to work. 3 months later, on a cold January evening, Laura sat in her small apartment above the studio, reviewing blueprints for a client project. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello? Laura. The voice was familiar, broken. It's Brandon. Laura's hand tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? I called your old number. The voicemail said it was disconnected. So I called your aunt. She gave me your studio number. Laura closed her eyes. What do you want, Brandon? I'm sorry. Silence. Laura, I'm so sorry. For everything. I didn't see what I was doing. I didn't see you. You saw me, Laura interrupted quietly. You saw me perfectly. You just didn't value what you saw. Brandon's voice cracked. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I ruined everything. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Laura looked out the window at the city lights. Thank you for saying that, Brandon. Do you forgive me? Laura thought about that question for a long time. No, she said finally. I don't forgive you, because forgiveness implies that what you did was a mistake. But it wasn't. It was a choice. You chose to control me. You chose to erase me. You chose cruelty over kindness, again and again. She paused. But I don't hate you either. I just don't think about you anymore. And that's how I know I've moved on. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. Then, are you happy? Laura looked around her small apartment, the design books stacked on the coffee table, the blueprints spread across the dining table, the framed photo of her and her mother at the studio's opening. Yes, Laura said. I am. Good, Brandon whispered. That's good. Goodbye, Brandon. Goodbye, Laura. She hung up. And for the first time in 7 years, Laura Whitfield felt completely, utterly free. Epilogue, 1 year later. The Ohio Small Business Journal. Rising Stars, Cincinnati's New Design Voices. Laura Whitfield's Over the Rhine studio has become one of Cincinnati's most sought-after residential design firms. In just 18 months, Whitfield Design Studio has completed over 40 projects across Ohio, with a waiting list that extends into next year. I focus on helping people reclaim their spaces, Whitfield explains during our interview. Sometimes a room stops serving you. Sometimes a home doesn't feel like yours anymore. My job is to help people transform those spaces into something that reflects who they are now, not who they used to be. It's a philosophy that seems deeply personal. Whitfield, who declined to discuss her previous marriage, Says her approach to design comes from understanding that change isn't always easy, but it's always possible. People think transformation has to be loud, she says, that you have to tear everything down and start over. But sometimes the most powerful transformations are quiet ones. You don't announce them, you just become. On a bright Saturday morning in May, Laura stood in the studio, hanging new photographs on the gallery wall. The space had grown. She'd hired 2 assistants and was considering expanding into the adjacent storefront. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. Elizabeth, dinner tonight? My treat. Laura, you're in town? Elizabeth, surprise. I'm outside. Laura looked toward the window and saw her mother standing on the sidewalk, waving. She laughed and walked to the door. You could have just come in, Laura said as Elizabeth entered. I didn't want to interrupt if you had clients. It's Saturday. I'm closed. Elizabeth looked around the studio, taking in the changes since her last visit. You've expanded. Business is good. I can see that, Elizabeth smiled. I'm proud of you, Laura. Really proud. I know. Laura gestured to the consultation table. Coffee? Always. They sat together, 2 women who'd found their way back to each other through crisis in Courtroom and the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust. I got an offer this week, Laura said casually. Oh? A developer in Cleveland wants to hire me for a mixed-use renovation project, 30 units, full creative control. It's a big contract. Elizabeth's eyes lit up. Laura, that's incredible. Are you going to take it? Laura smiled. I'm thinking about it. It would mean traveling back and forth to Cleveland for 6 months, maybe hiring more staff, growing faster than I planned. But I'm not sure I want to grow that fast. I like where I am right now. I like the pace. I like the work. I like having time to breathe. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Then don't take it, or take it on your terms. You don't owe anyone a yes, Laura. Not anymore. I know. Laura paused. It's strange. For so long, I felt like I had to justify every decision, like I had to prove I deserved to take up space. And now you know you do. Yeah, Laura looked at her mother. I learned that from you. In that courtroom, you didn't ask permission. You didn't apologize for being there. You just were. Elizabeth reached across the table and squeezed Laura's hand. You already knew how to do that, sweetheart. You just forgot for a while. I just reminded you. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood come alive outside. Dog walkers, joggers, a street musician setting up on the corner. Life moving forward. So, Elizabeth said eventually, dinner tonight? Where? That new Italian place in Mount Adams. I made reservations. Laura smiled. You're staying the weekend? If that's okay. More than okay. They stood to leave. As Laura locked up the studio, she paused and looked back at the space she'd built. The gallery wall, the consultation table, the sign above the door. Whitfield Design Studio. It wasn't a monument to the past. It was a declaration of the future. She'd kept the name not because she was defined by what she'd survived, but because she'd earned the right to decide what that name meant now. And it meant strength. It meant resilience. It meant starting over and building something beautiful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Laura turned off the lights and stepped outside. Elizabeth was waiting on the sidewalk, her face warm in the afternoon sun. Ready? Elizabeth asked. Laura locked the door behind her and smiled. Ready. They walked down the street together, mother and daughter, past the cafes and boutiques and Saturday shoppers. 2 women who'd fought their own battles, who'd lost and won and survived, who'd learned that the most powerful victories are the ones no one sees coming. Because silence isn't weakness. Silence is patience. Silence is strategy. Silence is the calm before the storm and the peace that comes after. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is not to shout your victory from the rooftops. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away, close the door behind you, and build something new. Something that's entirely, completely, beautifully yours. The most dangerous mistake is underestimating someone who never needed to prove themselves. And the strongest people don't kick down doors, they wait until the right one opens. Silence is not weakness, it's timing, it's power. It's knowing that truth doesn't need volume to be heard. Brandon Whitfield learned that lesson too late. But Laura Whitfield learned it just in time. And in the end, That made all the difference.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Subscribe, like, and click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.